Hello you lovely lot, and welcome back to my stagey channel here on YouTube. Today, if it wasn't already obvious by this stunning t-shirt I'm wearing, I'll be sharing with you guys all of my thoughts and feelings about Hercules the musical, which is currently at the Theatre Royal Drury Lane in London. So don your best peplos, grab your favourite amphora, and let's get into this. Now, if you're new here, let me catch you up to speed with just how this is going to work. My name's Flora and I have lots, and I mean lots of opinions when it comes to the theatre. These are opinions that some people think I'm unqualified to have, but I like sharing them with the internet anyway because it's fun. Before I get into my reviews, I do like to give a little bit of context for the show in terms of its background, its synopsis, and whether I've seen it before so that we're all on the same page before I start blabbing. And by blabbing, I mean sharing my highlights and my lowlights, basically what I liked and what I didn't. And as always, everything shared in this video is nothing but my own opinion, and you're perfectly welcome to disagree with me in the comments down below. Oh, and I feel like it should go without saying, a massive thank you to my family for planning this trip to go and see Hercules, without whom I wouldn't have been able to afford to go by myself. Now, with all of that out the way, I say we get on with the show. And first things first, a bit of background on this musical. So if you've been wandering around London lately, you'll know that Hercules the Musical at the Drury Lane is being advertised as the electrifying new musical, but Hercules the Musical is by no means new. Of course, it is based off of the Disney movie of the same name, which I think came out in 1997. Okay, we got it right. She does know her Disney trivia. Anyway, carrying on. Like I said, it is based off of that movie, a fantastic movie, if you couldn't tell by the t-shirt I'm wearing. But on top of the fact that this musical is based off of the movie, I want to clarify something. This is by no means a new musical at all. It is simply new to the UK. Hercules the stage musical actually started off-Broadway back in about 2019, although Alan Menken started working on it in 2017. It only ran for about a week as part of a summer program, but it debuted new songs alongside the songs that people know and love from the movie. And this music was by Alan Menken and Dave Zippel, with the book being by Christopher Diaz. From there, it was reworked and put to stage at the Paper Mill Playhouse, where it ran from February to March 2023. The music for this show was again by Menken and Zippel, but the revised book was now written by Kwame Kwei-Armah. After this paper mill run, the show then moved to Germany, Hamburg to be specific, in March of 2024. And this was actually the first Disney stage musical developed in Germany, which I think is a really interesting fact, meaning it wasn't developed, say, in the USA and then just translated into German. They reworked the entire thing and produced it in German for German audiences. This version of the show, much like the Paper Mill one, used Kwei-Armah's book as well as the original music. It was just, like I said, translated into German, and it is still running today and you can go and see it. And that all brings us up to now, with Hercules the Musical landing at the Theatre Royal Drury Lane for summer 2025. It is the German produced production that has been brought over as opposed to either of the two American runs. It does also have a few songs kind of added and rearranged, but all in all, other than the fact it's now in English, it is very similar to the German production. So that is of course a very brief history of the production to bring you up to speed, but in case you're unfamiliar with the story, here's a brief synopsis of Hercules the Musical. You'll be forgiven for thinking that Hercules the Musical just follows the plot of the movie of the same name, but in thinking that, you'd be wrong. Quite wrong, in fact. I'm gonna keep this synopsis perhaps a little briefer than I usually would, just because I feel like the story itself is something I want to talk about later on in this review, but I'm gonna do my best to give you the gist of it without dissecting it too much. So of course we start the show with Hercules, the namesake of the show, who is born to Zeus and Hera and then promptly stolen away as part of Hades' plot to overtake Mount Olympus. As a result of this, Hercules is turned human and then raised by a human woman called Despina. When he grows up, Despina tells Hercules the truth about how he came to be with her, as well as who his parents are, setting into motion the rest of the plot of the show, which is basically Hercules setting out to try and be a god once more and earn his place back on Mount Olympus. Along the way, we meet Meg, who is Hercules' love interest in the show, as well as Phil, who is his hero trainer. And then there's also Bob and Charles, Hades' kind of sidekicks. Hades is ultimately thwarted by the end of the show, and Hercules does earn his godliness back, and therefore can return to Olympus. However, I'm gonna leave it there because I will go into more detail later on in this video. I'll put a timestamp up here somewhere so you can find it if you want to skip ahead to that, because I really do feel like it's something I want to dive into in a lot more detail, so I'm gonna save it for later. That is the plot at its most simple, so hopefully that gives you enough of an idea of the story of the show to understand some of the things I'm talking about later on. But now the question you are all probably asking yourselves, because Flora, you're clearly a big Hercules the movie fan. Have you seen Hercules the Musical before? And the answer is yes, I have seen Hercules the musical before. I flew to Hamburg last summer to check out Hercules Das Heldenhaft musical at the Neue Flora Theatre and had an absolutely fantastic time, not least because I shared a name with the theatre. I did my best to vlog some of the trip. It's maybe not my best work, but I will pop a card up for you so that you can go and check that out if you want to get a little bit of a taste as to how the Germans do theatre. But it's safe to say that I thought at the time the show was truly fantastic and I really enjoyed it. I even got to go on a backstage tour as well as get up on the stage and gain a really cool, unique perspective about the scale of the set that these actors were on every night. Now, seeing it in London was of course my first time seeing it in English, as the Hamburg production, like I said, is in German. Similarly, the show was tweaked for the London run as well as to better suit the Drury Lane Theatre. I feel like it's also important for me to clarify, less on a have I seen Hercules basis, but sort of my understanding of ancient Greece and ancient civilizations in general. I did study ancient history and classics all the way up through A-level as well as at university, so when it comes to things like ancient Greek representation, I am quite hot on it, I would say, but I feel like it's important for you guys to know just how much ancient Greek knowledge is stored in this brain, and it will probably, if you couldn't guess by me referencing Peplos and Amphora at the top of the video, come out throughout this review. So you have been forewarned about that. I really enjoyed this show when I went to see it in Germany, so how did it stack up on the West End? How about we find out and start with the highlights? The biggest highlight of this musical, at least to me, were the muses, our Greek chorus of the show. If I were to name only one reason to go and see Hercules, it would be the muses. Candace, Charlene, Brianna, Melinda, and Robin brought the house down. They were phenomenal. They absolutely stole the show, in my opinion, with their gorgeous voices and absolutely captivating energy. I think this is helped by the fact that the muses do sing arguably the most iconic and most well numbers in the show, bar maybe one song. Of course, including Gospel Truth, Zero to Hero, and A Star Is Born, all heavy hitters. But they also have a number of new songs in the show, including Great Bolts of Thunder, which are really fun to watch as well. Their role in the show is to narrate it for us. Like I kind of hinted at, they function like a Greek chorus would in an actual ancient Greek show. They're filling the audience in on what's happening, giving us exposition, as well as kind of telling us how to feel about certain moments, yet at the same time, they do it all whilst stealing the show. To the point that they were so much of a highlight that the rest of the show kind of just felt irrelevant. Well, maybe not irrelevant, that's quite harsh, but I did leave the show forgetting that it was supposed to be a story about Hercules. They did overshadow most characters in the show, to be honest, but I'm really not mad about it because it was so worth it. The muses also had the best costumes in the show. They were in new costumes and wigs for just about every scene they were in the show, which in and of itself is impressive. Personal favourites for me were the armour-like outfits they wore during Great Bolts of Thunder, where the big plumes on top of their helmets were actually their hair. I also loved their reporter coats, which were styled kind of like ancient Greek black figure pots, which are some of the most iconic archaeological finds from the time period. The Zero to Hero cheerleader costumes were also really fun. And I think on top of the fact that these performers were all incredible, they all looked incredible throughout the show, which just added to the appeal of the muses. And I know it's going to come across as slightly harsh, but I do genuinely think that the muses were the saving grace of this show. Without them, this would have been a show that I would have really struggled to get through. These women and their gospel sound were just so flawless that no matter what else was happening on stage, they were the ones you wanted to watch. And so naturally they had to be the first highlight on this list because wow, just wow. So the next highlight for me was the colour. This show was just so bright and saturated throughout that it was a real visual treat to watch. I feel like so many shows at the moment are very grayscale, very muted, very monotone. Not to name names, but Jamie Lloyd does come to mind. So it's nice to see that real variety and brightness of colour on stage. The muses, of course, were the most colourful with their bold patterns and colours, making them stand out relative to the rest of the cast on stage, as well as the set. They were in bold oranges, pinks, blues, golds throughout the show, which made them really eye-catching. Outside of that, each main character also had their own colour palette, which I really enjoyed. Meg is in these gorgeous deep purples and pinks throughout the show. Phil is often in a grassy green, and Hercules is more often than not in some combination of gold and white. The gods too are in those bright whites and golds, whilst those in the underworld are in more earthy grey tones. I think choosing such distinct colour palettes for each of their characters really helped tell the story of the show, as well as help engage the audience by making each character so visually interesting to look at. Like, I genuinely don't think there is anything I can do to truly get across to you just how bright and colourful this show is to watch. It's like watching High School Musical too, right? The saturation's turned up 120%. You cannot escape the colour, meaning you are just dazzled from start to finish. There's not a dull moment. element, and I think I've really missed that in theatre. Carrying on from colour though, the set too of this show was fantastic. The sheer size of the Theatre Royal Drury Lane is really taken advantage of by this set, although weirdly set is actually used quite sparingly and is often very simple. The biggest asset this set has going for it to me are the 8 massive columns that they have. Fluted Doric columns to be precise, in case anyone was wondering. These columns were all moving in pairs throughout the show to create different settings and scenes as needed, and the way they towered over the cast members really helped build this sense of scale and grandeur, which was really nice. It was just very impressive, I think is probably the right way to describe it. Now, I don't know what scale these columns are relative to the size of the columns over in Germany, but I did stand next to the ones on the set in Germany, and my god, they were intimidating to stand next to with how big they were. I think when you have a theatre the size of the Drury Lane, you really do need a big set to fill it, and Hercules the Musical here certainly does that. For context, as I think it helps if you don't know how big the Theatre Royal Drury Lane stage is, the Fortune Theatre, which is literally across the road, that entire building can fit on the Drury Lane stage. So it's big. I do think, and I will elaborate on this later in the video, that this set, as nice and lovely and grand as it is to look at, does struggle to create more moments of intimacy throughout the show, but perhaps that's a small price to pay for ensuring that the show and its characters don't feel dwarfed on that Drury Lane stage. I know I already touched on it earlier, but the costumes in this show, again, are phenomenally gorgeous. The muses, of course, looked fantastic throughout, but I thought I would use the costumes highlight to focus on some of the other costumes throughout the show that I really enjoyed, as well as some updates I noticed over the German production. Some costumes were completely different, most notably Hades and Phil, although they won't be in the highlights section. They've got a whole section in the lowlights for themselves, so we will get to that later. I did also notice that he's not called Germany, he's called Hercules. Okay, I did also notice that Hercules' golden breastplate, which in Germany was made up of 2 pieces, for this West End production was made up of 1 piece. Though I will say, since I wrote the script for this video, they have updated the German costume, and now Hercules in Germany also wears the 1 piece as opposed to the 2-piece breastplate. Not a drastic change, but one I definitely noticed. And then just briefly, the townsfolk costumes were also really nice. They were fun, flowy, and they had this nice kind of earthy colour palette to them with soft blues and greens, which really set them apart from the dazzling whites and golds of the gods, which again, visual storytelling I really liked. I think differentiating between the townsfolk and the immortals was a really clever decision to make. And then my final highlight is going to be the bow and arrow. Now, you might be thinking, Flora, that's a weird highlight to have. And I'm like, yes, but it was also my favourite effect in the show. But I will give this a quick caveat. Spoilers, if you don't want to know how this works, skip ahead to the lowlights, which start here. Now, if you're wondering why on earth I care so much about this effect, it's because when I'm not blabbering on the internet about theatre, I enjoy doing archery. And not to brag or anything, but I would say I'm pretty good at it. I know, I have hobbies outside of the theatre, who'd have thought. But anyway, this simple effect was achieved in 2 parts. First, you have the bow and arrow. Each time Hercules would draw an arrow, it really would look like he was drawing an arrow, and then he'd let the arrow loose. But no health and safety officer in their right mind would likely let an actor do archery on stage. Instead, Hercules draws back what is effectively an elastic band painted to look like the arrow, with fletching on the end to complete the look. Then, when he loosed the arrow, it would disappear like he'd fired it off. The second part of this effect was achieved by arrows popping out of the columns or the target that Hercules was shooting at. So as he lets go of the string, the arrow flies off, and then the other arrow, say in the column, sort of shoots out. Does that make sense? I'm describing this really badly, but it would pop out so it looks like the arrow he's just let fly has thudded into the column or the target. This created such a brilliant illusion of the arrow being let loose, flying, and then hitting a target. And again, it was so simple. And I love effects like this because, like I keep saying, they are so simple, but at their core, so effective, and often leave an audience going, wow, how did they do that? So yeah, naturally, I wanted to make that my final highlight. All right, that really was a whistle-stop tour of the things I liked about this show. So it's time to descend into the underworld and take a look at what lowlights lurk down there. And we're going to start off with the screens. Oh god, here she goes again. Flora's moaning about screens being used in the theatre. No, I actually quite enjoyed the way the screens were used in this show. I think the mosaic styling of the background was really fun and creative and actually quite a unique way of doing your backgrounds. But the screens did have one glaring issue, and that's the fact that they were always on. Now, I'm not saying they should have just turned them off at points throughout the show and left them blank by any means. I just think when some people are considering using screens in their shows, they forget the fact that these screens emit light. More specifically, LED screens over projections, because I think they give off much more light than people think, even if what they're displaying is like dark scenes. Does that make sense? So even if it's displaying a night sky, they're still giving off quite a lot of light. This means the show can never truly take advantage of darkness, something which can be an incredibly useful tool when lighting a show. And I think this was most obvious to me during some of Hercules' solo moments. He's downstage singing his little heart out under a spotlight, but that spotlight is far less vivid and far less sharp because there's no true darkness around him. You're basically just adding more light to a scene that is already pretty light. I feel like this really diminished the visual impact that moments like this could have had, just because he wasn't surrounded by enough darkness to really make it sort of punchy and drive home. It happened in other moments as well. I know I noticed it quite a lot in the I Won't Say number. The brightness of the screens in the back made the rest of the scene feel kind of quite flat in the way it had been lit, and therefore I don't think that lighting can truly be used to convey how the characters are feeling in a scene. Like, was this a massive issue? Did it ruin the show? No, because the LED screens, like I said, did add so much vibrancy throughout the rest of the show. I just kind of wanted to flag it as something that I really sort of couldn't stop noticing. And moving on from that, the next low light for me was the scale. Now, I know I touched on the fact that the show and the set was very impressive. From the facade to the columns, it was all very grand. But it did have one major issue for me, and that was the fact that it kind of failed to expand and contract. Now, when I'm talking about scale here, I don't think I'm necessarily talking about the scale of the set itself, and more the set's ability to really channel visual focus on certain areas of the set. This may well be due to how the set was built, with the columns remaining on the stage for the majority of the show, or perhaps because of a lack of any real darkness. But at any given time, I feel like you had a lot more to look at throughout the show than just the sort of one character giving an amazing solo that you're supposed to be focusing on. Even scenes that are supposed to take place in smaller settings, like the scenes at Hercules' house, never really felt kind of small and intimate like I feel like they should have. A show's ability to expand and contract an audience's visual focus is often really overlooked, I think, but it's something that's super important. Big punchy moments don't feel as big and punchy if you don't have those smaller, more intimate moments. It's all about balance. When everything maintains a very similar scale throughout the show, everything feels a lot flatter. Everything kind of merges together. I don't think it differentiates enough between the individual scenes. A good way of looking at this to me is kind of comparing it to movies. The scale of a movie expands and contracts over the course of its story with things like wide shots, close-ups, etc. Hercules the musical to me felt like watching a movie that was only shot with wide angles. Whilst having those big moments and the scale of the set was, like I keep saying, truly impressive, when your whole show takes place on the same scale of wow, look how big the set is, I don't think we can truly appreciate wow, how big the set is, because we never have those smaller moments where we can focus in on just sections of it. Moving on, I think the next lowlight might take some explaining from me, but I'm gonna do my best to try and get across what I think my point is. And that is the fact that I feel like the show very much lacked maturity. Now, it's a Disney show, okay, I wasn't expecting it to be this like really hard-hitting political drama, of course I wasn't, but the show is full of fun and humour, as I think many people would expect it to be. However, it to me lacked any real emotional depth. Now, I'm not asking them to explore any greater emotional depth than is explored in the movies, say like Frozen the musical does, expanding on say the inner turmoil of Elsa, but I think this stage show really abandoned the emotional richness that made the movie so enjoyable. I mentioned Frozen the musical because I do think it is a fantastic example of how Disney theatrical takes a source material of their movie and expands it further to get a deeper exploration of the themes that the movie originally established. Lion King and Aladdin as well, I think, do this, even if it is to a slightly lesser extent. Hercules the musical, by contrast, fails to explore any emotional depth, really. The main theme of the movie, at least to me anyway, is a question on what it is to be human, to love, to lose, and to ultimately do what's right, as opposed to doing what's easy. We explore this through Hercules as he rises to the challenges thrown his way, as he learns that a true hero hero doesn't do it for guts and glory, but does it because it's what's right. By contrast, through all the chopping and changing that this musical does to the story, which I promise we will get onto later, the stage show, I felt, told us a story where good wins simply because good has to win, and that's how the show was written and that's how it has to end, not because any of our characters did any emotional growth throughout the show to really earn the ending. Even if this wasn't how it was intended when the story was rewritten, that's very much how it came across to me, and that's how the conclusion felt, and ultimately it was quite unsatisfying as a result. I have no issue with Disney Theatrical taking the show in a less serious, more light-hearted direction, especially compared to, say, the previous Disney show that was based at the Drury Lane, Frozen. The humour and light-hearted nature of the movie, I think, is what made it so iconic to so many people. But the silliness only works because of how well balanced it is with everything else. The emotional undertones throughout the movie really do balance out that humour. Without any of this, I feel like the show just lacked a soul. It was leaning more towards high-budget pantomime than an artistic exploration of any real themes or meaning, and that was disappointing. It is a show aimed at families. It's a Disney show after all. You can't go in expecting a hugely profound, hard-hitting statement, but the original movie is aimed at families too and still manages to present a beautiful story. Instead, with this stage show, it felt like they were holding my hand, pulling me through the story in an almost patronizing way that made it truly difficult to connect and see the potential emotional depth underneath all of the cheap humour. So maybe this feeling of the show lacking maturity stems from compounding issues such as the chopping and changing they did to the story as well as the rushed ending, but I really cannot stand art that doesn't have anything to say, even if it is a very surface level thing they want to say. It had no lasting emotional impact, which I do think is a real shame because of what we know Disney capable of doing. Carrying on, I've named this next lowlight Style versus Substance, and I think it's because I want to talk about the fact that throughout the show I couldn't shake the feeling that the design of the shows in many ways was diametrically opposed to the book of the show or the substance of the show. The set was gorgeous and took on this semi-realistic edge to it. The towering columns stood out wonderfully against the bright sky in the background, and the town and the ruins felt like part of a really lived-in world. The puppets had a realistic design to them as well, or at least as realistic as you can make a Hydra and a Cyclops. Both the set and puppets had this great grandeur to them, and all of this felt as though it was in opposition to the slightly silly, almost childish book of the show. The set and the puppets felt like they belonged in a far more serious show. They lacked the same fun, almost whimsical quality to them that, say, a lot of the costumes had. I think with the puppets in particular, Germany did a better job with regards to how they balanced them with the tone set by the rest of the show. They were far more whimsical and cartoonish, which I think tied them in better overall to the rest of the show. The West End set and puppets felt over-designed relative to what the show actually needed, and therefore I think the German production did handle them better and overall felt more cohesive. It just felt a bit jarring to see a set and puppets that didn't quite match up with the energy the show was presenting to the audience. And again, I do think part of this stems from the fact that the book itself lacked in any real depth, so we were trying to get these moments of sort of realism within it, but it didn't work simply because the established tone of the show didn't match with what they were showing us. I think the German production manages to balance that stylized design with this big campy musical far better than this West End adaptation has. One of the biggest disappointments in this show for me was Hades. Stephen Carlisle, I think, did a great job, so this isn't a dig at him, but I do think this show really spoilt the character of Hades, which is a shame because he's one of my favourite parts about the movie.
Hey, two thumbs way up.
James Wood's portrayal of Hades in the movie made the character to me so iconic and is part of what contributes to him being one of the best Disney villains, at least in my opinion. Yet in the musical, there doesn't seem to be a trace of this Hades at all. In the musical, he's whiny and irritating as opposed to a credible threat to Hercules and Mount Olympus.
Olympus would be that way.
Gone is his quick wit and sarcasm, which diminished the character significantly. Felt much more like a toddler having a tantrum than a villain that we were supposed to actually fear. Think a pantomime villain you're supposed to laugh at as opposed to a credible threat to the plot of your story. It felt immature and it just really didn't work for me. The decision was also made for this show to dress Hades in red as opposed to his iconic blues, greys and blacks. Aside from the fact that dressing him in blues, greys and blacks would have set him directly opposite the golds and the whites worn by the gods on Mount Olympus, I noticed that the changing colour scheme really seemed to confuse the children around me, with one of them even asking if it was Jafar. Part of good character design is making your character instantly recognisable, so why did we change it? I know there are moments in the movie where Hades' hair goes up in flames and he does have traces of red around him then. However, he's not a character I associate with red. I agree with the kids that were sat near me. He looked far more like someone dressed up like Jafar than he did like Hades. I also question the change simply because in Germany, he does wear greys and blues and blacks, and he looks fantastic. They even let him keep his blue hair, and there's also a song about it. In my opinion, you can play around with character design, you can change it up, but you need to keep the core elements of what makes your character, like, there. If Sky Swister, the guy that designed the costumes for this show, sees this video and would like to explain himself, that would be great, because I need a chat with them to hear them try and justify why this decision was made, because it feels like a very bizarre one, especially for Disney, who is so often so hot on character integrity. Why are we just throwing out everything that makes Hades out the window? I think all of this combined, changing his colour palette and changing his attitude and giving him some really quite bad jokes, all just served to make the character of Hades so disappointing to me. Again, no shade to the performer, they were just working with the material that they got. But this version of Hades was unrecognisable from his movie counterpart, and that is such a shame, because like I said, James Wood made this character iconic.
Yes, Hades rules!
And changes to Hades aside, I kept hinting at it throughout this video, but the story of this show was changed very drastically, and I'm not convinced the changes worked. Ignoring the fact that the movie is nothing like the myth, the stage musical feels about as foreign to the story of Disney's Hercules the movie as I'm sure Disney's Hercules the movie would feel to the ancient Greeks. So let's discuss the changes that the stage show makes to the story. I'm going to do my best to sort of describe them in order. But there is a lot to get through, so buckle in. Our first change happens very early on in the musical, where Hades doesn't find out about the prophecy from 3 Fates, he finds it out from a bloke called Tiresias, who's just on Olympus at the party that Zeus and Hera are throwing. Now, if you know anything about Greek mythology, which I do, then you'll know that Tiresias isn't just any old random guy. He's actually a blind prophet, which is super handy when he's going around spewing out prophecies. But Tiresias never prophesied anything about Hercules, at least not in any of the surviving myths we know about today. It just felt like such a random change, particularly because Tiresias isn't in the German production. And also, Tiresias never reappears. He drops his prophecy, then dips. And so I feel like there would have been much better ways for us to get the information about the prophecy to the audience as well as to Hades without introducing this like random old guy for 5 minutes and then never seeing him again. The prophecy is also different. In the movie, we learn that when the planets all align, the Titans will be released.
Unleash the Titans!
And Hades plans on using these Titans to help overthrow Olympus so he can claim it for himself. It's only Hercules, as he learns through the prophecy, that stands in his way, so he sends his 2 minions, Pain and Panic, to kill Hercules. In the stage show, and bear with me here, Tiresias tells Hades that when the 2 moons align, he will have the chance to take on the Olympians and win, with Hercules again being the only person that stops him. So Hades then does the same thing to take Hercules out of the picture by making him mortal and sending his minions to off him. Am I the only one confused by this prophecy? I completely understand them not wanting to have to hire people to create 4 massive Titan puppets. That's so fair. But 2 moons? Is there a second moon I don't know about? That needed to be better explained to me. Also, why do the 2 moons make it easier for Hades to take over Olympus versus any other time of the year? It just didn't make sense, and I know it's, ooh, ancient Greek prophecy, it doesn't need to make sense, but it does. It does. 2 moons aside, why is now the time for Hades to try and do it versus 20 years ago? It felt half-finished, and also is different to the prophecy that is told in the German production. The prophecy also impacts the big sort of finale fight, shall we say. Instead of Hercules taking on the Titans with the gods by his side, Hercules and Hades face off directly, joined by the gods and the villagers, meaning he doesn't fight Hades all by himself. Moving on, another difference happens when Hercules goes to the Temple of Zeus. Now the Temple of Zeus and Hera, because this show makes Hera a much bigger deal than the movie ever did, and he goes there to speak to his parents for the first time. In the movie, Zeus tells Hercules in order to become deified, he needs to become a true hero on Earth, and that's how he would regain access to Mount Olympus. He then gifts Hercules Pegasus and sends him on his way. This time, however, Hercules is told that to become a god again, he has to do something that no god would ever do. I'm not quite sure why this change was necessary, especially when it comes to how this plays out towards the end of the show, but it feels clunky and overall damages the message that the show has. But also, what do you mean do something no god has ever done? That's so vague. Zeus has never taken no as a full sentence, so maybe that'd be a good place to start. But carrying on, Zeus and Hera don't gift Hercules Pegasus. I know, no Pegasus in this show. We have Cyclopses we have minotaurs, we have hydras, but no Pegasus, because apparently giving my guy flying pony was one step too far for the props department. I now present to you my badly photoshopped version of what I think the Pegasus puppet could have looked like, so you guys can see what we might have been missing out on had they not pussied out and made the show more realistic. Next change, Phil's no longer half goat. Yep, he's no longer a satyr. He's just like a guy, which means One Last Hope is completely different because all of the fun goat puns have been ripped out of it. I don't know why he's no longer a goat. In Germany, he's still half goat, and satyr costumes are so easy to make. I mean, even the ancient Greeks had them way back when. It's literally where the word satire comes from. It again seems really odd given that there are other mythical creatures throughout the show. I do wonder whether it was maybe an actor decision just because of the warmth of, say, the fluffy goat legs that he might have had to wear, or the hoof shoes, but at the same time the song was rewritten, so it does feel like a far more deliberate choice. The next change we see is the way in which Hercules saves Meg. Instead of diving into the river Styx to save her like he does in the movie, he gives up his godliness as his final act by drinking the last drops of hydra venom that was supposed to be given to him as a baby, and then jumps into this thing the show calls the vortex to save her. Thus he does what no god would ever do, give up his godliness, earning his godliness back. I see where they were going with this. Obviously, when Hercules jumps into the Styx in the movie, he still has his godliness and therefore he was never in any real danger. So therefore you could argue that it wasn't really a truly selfless risk. But this change feels clunky. In both scenarios, he's prepared to sacrifice himself. I don't see why the change was needed. Herc in the movies doesn't know that the river won't kill him, so it's still a selfless sacrifice in my opinion. All of this, I think, culminates in creating a main character who is just not very memorable. He was the least memorable part of the show, which isn't a great sign, particularly when the show is literally named after this character. That isn't to say that Luke Brady isn't a fantastic Hercules. He is. The character development, and therefore the audience's ability to connect with Hercules as a character was just limited by this really dodgy story. The show is also surprisingly short. I don't know why, but the conclusion felt really rushed. It's like they ran out of ideas and their plan kind of fizzled out, and they kind of remembered that they needed an ending for the show. It's also worth noting that the story for the West End production is also slightly different than the story in Germany. I think this is one of the rare occasions where Disney maybe should have stuck more closely to their own source material and then expanded on that by adding new songs to flesh it out. If they can bring Lion King to life on stage, a story which literally has no humans in it at all, then I feel like they can bring Hercules to stage, meaning a more faithful production including monsters and flying horses. I think they were just a little scared and perhaps had the purse strings pulled a little too tight, so instead they wrote out most of what would have been considered expensive to put on stage, and what they wrote instead was meh, kind of mediocre. Okay, so the final lowlight is perhaps less of a real lowlight and more an excuse for me to talk about Greek myth for 10 minutes. It's landed itself in the lowlights because I think paying attention to the real Greek myth that inspired the Disney movie would have actually really aided this production, particularly with regards to its show design in the long run. Of course, I wasn't expecting a truly faithful adaptation of the Hercules myth from Disney. Those were very, very dark, and let's just say Meg doesn't quite get her happy ending at the hands of ancient Greek writers. Or I suppose storytellers. Lots of this was oral before they decided to write it down. I just wish the nods to real Greek mythology that had made the movie so fun had hung around a bit more for the stage show. We're gonna start off with the fact that Hercules the musical gets Hercules' mum's name wrong. Despite the fact that she's named correctly in the movie, the stage show for some reason just decided to give Hercules' human mum a completely different name. In the myth and in the movie, she's called Alcmene. In the musical, they called her Despina, a name for which I can find no real ancient Greek precedent for. It just seems like such an odd change, and one that I'd absolutely love to know the reason for. Next up, there's a scene in Zero to Hero where Hercules fights a minotaur and then comes back wearing the minotaur's skin as a cape. I liked this. This was fun. However, I think there was one change they could have made that would have made it 1,000 times better. Hercules is known in historical depictions for rocking a snazzy fur cloak, and he does acquire it by slaying a beast. But Hercules never took on a minotaur. That was Theseus. Instead, he fought the Nemean lion. This simple change would have created something quite satisfying for those people that actually care about the Hercules myth. In fact, in the movie, the Nemean lion skin that Hercules is seen wearing is actually Scar from the Lion King, which I think's hilarious. Another issue I took with the show was all of the Roman-based humour. Perhaps I took issue with this primarily because the show is set in this vague rendition of ancient Greece. Now, there is considerable overlap between the classical and Hellenistic periods in Greece and the Roman Republic and later Empire, so it's not unreasonable to think that maybe this ancient Greece is one in which Rome also exists, but depictions of Hercules have been found dating back to 5,000 to 7,000 years before Rome ever existed. I just think I would have preferred if they'd maybe stayed in the ancient Greek lane a little bit more, particularly when so many of the jokes from the movie were Greek-centric, like calling Thebes the Big Olive and Meg saying Peloponnesian Minute in a reference to the New York Minute.
But I could see through that in a Peloponnesian Minute.
I don't know why we kept going back to, well, Rome wasn't built in a day. I'm like, yeah, Rome's possibly not been built yet, babes. But carry on. I did wonder whether all these references to Rome as opposed to ancient Greek was because the writers felt as though their audiences, both in the UK and Germany, would be more familiar with Roman references, simply because of how much Roman history our two nations have. I personally remember that in school, ancient Rome took far much more teaching time than ancient Greece ever did, until I went on to study ancient Greek and classics up till uni level. So it could be, like I said, that the writers felt that the UK had more cultural context for these Roman jokes than the Greek jokes, but I kind of disagree there. The only fitting thing about the constant Rome references is that despite the show being set in ancient Greece, they actually use the Roman name for their main character. That's right, Hercules is actually the Roman name of this Greek hero. To the Greeks, he would have been known as Heracles. Speaking of the name Heracles, I don't know why the show tried to make Hera such a big deal. Maybe, and most likely, it's because of the lack of any real female leads in the show. But again, you're probably thinking, what on earth does this have to do with the name Heracles? Now, you may not know this, and total nerd out moment here, but the name Heracles actually translates to the glory of Hera. In the Greek myths, Hercules was actually really hated by Hera because he was the result of one of Zeus's many, many affairs. She hurled monsters at him, threw challenges his way, and Hercules rose to all of them. As such, is claimed by Greek author Diodorus that Heracles, got his name because he gained his glory because of Hera, even if that wasn't her intention to begin with. And then I picked one final thing because I don't want to go about this forever, but as you can tell, I have a lot of information to share on this topic. I think I just wished in this show that the Olympians' costumes were a little bit more unique. Whilst they were all dressed in white and gold and visually very snazzy and very godlike, you couldn't really tell anyone apart from a few. Obviously you had Zeus and Hera who named themselves, you had one guy who had grapevines in his crown, so I'm assuming that was Dionysus, and then you had one guy with a big winged helmet, so obviously that's Hermes, but everyone else was just kind of the same. Maybe if I saw the costumes up close it would be a different story, but from where I was sat in like the front 5 rows of the stalls, I couldn't differentiate them. And I think that's so disappointing. The Greek gods in the movie are all different colours and all have such iconic designs that I wish we'd seen a little bit more of that brought through to the designs of the gods' costumes in the show. Particularly because the ancient Greeks were so on top of having symbolism for each of their gods. They all had a bird, they all had plants that were associated with them, they all had iconic things. Athena, for example, is really closely associated with something called the Aegis, which is like the head of Medusa incorporated into a bit of clothing, either a poncho or like an ancient Greek poncho, I'm not quite sure. We're not quite sure what this would have looked like, but it was very much associated with her. Hera, for example, massively associated with peacocks, right? It's one of her birds. Incorporate a peacock feather design into her costumes. Someone like Apollo, really associated with the sun. Give his costume a sun motif. There's so much you could do to make each of these costumes, whilst they all look great as a collective, individualistic to each of the gods they represent. To me, these small tweaks would have made the world of difference. So overall, whilst I wrote my review without these critiques in mind, because I know it's such nitpicking from me about like ancient Greek accuracy, because I do think if they'd paid more attention to real ancient Greek history, they would have had so much more design ideas to play off of to really make the show feel true to the history, but also fun, fresh, and whimsical in a way that they would want. To me, it just comes off as oversight or maybe lack of care in the source material when it comes to designing things like the costume, particularly when design changes were made from the German show. And I also think, like I hinted at earlier, the sort of tongue-in-cheek, yeah, we know this isn't accurate references that were made throughout the movie were part of what made it so good. So to throw those out the window entirely is just damaging to the overall effect that you have at the end of the day. At least in my opinion. I think Hades summed it up pretty nicely when he said,
We were so close! So close. We tripped at the finish line.
This show had so much potential, but it was let down by a series of bizarre story choices and creative direction. It's one of my favourite Disney movies, if you couldn't tell, so by all accounts, I should have loved it. The spectacle of it all cannot be denied, as the show is incredibly fun from a visual standpoint. However, relative to other Disney theatrical productions, this one was more of a Greek tragedy than a heroic success. success. Sorry, I had to get that line in there somewhere. That being said, if you overlook the odd plot changes, I do think this is a fun show to take older kids to go and see. Hercules the musical is booking at the Theatre Royal Drury Lane until March 2026, so you have plenty of time to go and check it out. As always, if you enjoyed my review and want to hear more of my stagey opinions, then make sure you subscribe so you don't miss out on any future videos, and maybe consider watching some of the others I have up at the minute. Give this video a thumbs up and feel free to share your own thoughts and feelings in the comments down below. But for now, I've been Flora, those have been my opinions, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!